Good evening and welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm Bishop Lainey Peterson. My regular co-host, Bishop Canterbury, can't be with us tonight, but I am being joined by my very special co-host, Brother Jonathan of the Apostolic Joanite Church. Welcome, brother.
Thank you, Bishop. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we have an even more special guest this evening, Dr. Siobhán Houston, who is the author of 3 books, including Invoking Mary Magdalene, Accessing the Wisdom of the Divine Feminine, Priests, Gnostics, and Magicians, the European Roots of the Esoteric Independent Catholicism, and Gnostic Healing, co-authored with Tal Malachi. She is a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and she was a doctoral student at the University of Exeter's Center for the Study of Esotericism and has a doctorate from the Graduate Theological Foundation. Her work has been published in Parabola, Gnosis Magazine, the Theosophical History Journal, and many other periodicals and anthologies. Dr. Houston, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Bishop Lainey.
I wanted to let everybody know that in the past, we did a show on recommended Gnostic books, and Dr. Houston's magnificent work, Priests, Gnostics, and Magicians, was one of the books that we did recommend on the show to people who were interested in learning about modern Gnosticism. In fact, I believe, and we were talking about this before the show, Brother Jonathan, that Dr. Houston's book is one of a kind. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's been made available by anybody else. So we owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Houston. So just kind of coming in here, Dr. Houston, what are we referring to when we talk about the Gnostic Restoration? We hear that term bandied about a bit in our communities, but what does that refer to?
It really refers to the beginning of the Gnostic Church of France, which was started by Jules Doinel in 1888, and in 1890 he proclaimed that year as the first year of the era of Gnosis restored. So that's where the term comes from. Okay. And it really talks about Gnosticism being brought into the modern world and set up in an ecclesiastical structure.
And this happened long before the Nag Hammadi discovery.
Yes, yes.
Many people think of Gnosticism as something that was connected to that discovery, but in fact, there were people who had restored that church or that way of spirituality even well before that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we can't do an exact reconstruction of Gnosticism, and of course, Gnosticism means so many things when you talk about the early Christian Gnostics. Yes. There was a great diversity of groups, but as far as modern Gnosticism, Jules Doinel is one of the leading figures. And it all started primarily in France.
In France. And so what was going on in France, culturally and intellectually, that spurred this event?
Well, in the late 1800s, there was a great interest in occult and magical topics, not just among scholars and a few eccentrics, but the wider public. Especially artists, musicians, and so forth were very drawn to magic and mysticism, Kabbalah, and even Satanism. And there was a lot of proliferation of literature at that time on these topics. Many new esoteric groups were formed, and the Vatican became so concerned about this that they promulgated an encyclical in 1884 that was promulgated by Leo XIII, where they warned Catholics about getting involved in esoteric groups and reading literature connected to occultism and magic. And they also made it not quite mandatory, but Roman Catholics could be excommunicated for being Freemasons.
Oh, okay. And
right.
So the restoration of the Gnostic Church then, was that connected to the fact that there were people who were Freemasons or may have been part of these esoteric orders and still wanted a connection to the church, or?
I think it was a general feeling from the Vatican, like Freemasonry was a popular movement at the time, and that Roman Catholics should not take part in this. However, in France, this seems to have been largely ignored because many priests were Freemasons, and they continued to be active in Freemasonry work.
Do you know what the objection of the Vatican was to Freemasonry? What kind of, did Freemasonry present a threat, or was it a doctrinal incompatibility, or what was the problem that the Vatican had with Freemasonry?
I think both of those things were problems. Yeah. And also, anything that erodes the authority of the church is dangerous in Rome's eyes.
Absolutely. Brother Jonathan, do you have any questions?
Sure. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Jules Doinel, and what was his background, and how did he come to Gnosticism and start this church?
Sure. Well, Jules Doinel was born in 1842, and he was dabbling in various mystical groups, including the Swedenborgian Church and the Masons, and he started studying two Gnostic groups from the Middle Ages, the Bogomils, who were active from the 10th to the 15th century in the Balkans, and the Cathars of France, who were active mid-12th century to the early 14th century. The Cathars were also in Italy, so southern France, northern Italy. And in 1888, he had a vision of the Aeon Jesus, an emanation of God, telling him that he was now going to be the patriarch of a Gnostic church, and that that was his charge, to begin a Gnostic church. And so he was consecrated as a bishop, but through an inner contact. Traditionally, there's a laying on of hands of 3 other bishops when a priest is consecrated as bishop, but this was done, at least in his eyes, through an inner contact with Jesus.
Okay. Now, eventually, he did go on to start a church. Mm-hmm. And can you tell us a little bit about that church?
Sure. He received more instructions through the inner planes in a series of seances that happened in France. And he was contacted by a Cathar synod of bishops, according to Jules Doinel. And he was given more instructions on how to set up the church. And so he did this in 1890. And it was a Cathar reconstruction in the sense that he borrowed a couple of the 2 primary Cathar sacraments, which is the consolamentum and the apparamentum. And I can talk about those a little bit if you'd like. So the Cathars practiced these sacraments differently than Jules Doinel did. But the consolamentum for Jules Doinel was a mystic initiation rite. For the Cathars, it really was a baptism and an ordination kind of rolled into one. Okay. And if you were a Cathar in the Middle Ages and you accepted the sacrament of the consolamentum, you became a monk. You no longer ate meat. You became extremely ascetic, completely devoted to the Cathar doctrine. And as long as you didn't break any of the rules that were connected with the sacrament, you were guaranteed salvation. Mm-hmm. Jules Doinel did a modified version of this, so it was kind of an entry into the church and an initiation rite, as I said. And there weren't any strictures associated with it, so you didn't have to be celibate afterwards. You could still eat meat and so forth. And the apparamentum was more of a penance and absolution sacrament under Doinel. And with the Cathars, they would do this as a monthly collective rite. But Jules Doinel instituted this sacrament to be done personally. So you would go to your bishop, and they did ordain women in the Doinel church. Okay. The men were called bishops, women were called Sophias. Okay. And they usually administered dioceses in pairs. So you would go to your bishop or your Sophia, and you would bind your wrists with white cloth, and you would kneel in front of them, and you would confess your sins, and they would do a laying on of hands. and absolve you of your sins and give you a blessing. So that was the way Doinel kind of modified the sacrament for his modern church.
That is really interesting. I'm curious about the use of the word Sophias. I understand why he would call his female bishops Sophias. About 20 years ago, I met a Southern Baptist minister who had been at a conference where there had been a Gnostic bishop from Greece present, and in his church there was an office of Sophia, but it doesn't sound like Doinel's Sophias, because apparently what her function was to rebuke the archbishop. The only person who could rebuke the archbishop was Sophia, but it sounds kind of different, and I kind of wish I'd paid more attention. I could have found out, what this church was all about, but it's very, very interesting. So it's absolutely fascinating. Doinel's, what he managed to build up and to do something very different. Can you tell us what happened to his church?
Yes, what went on for another 5 years with him as the patriarch, and he left the church actually in 1895 and became a Roman Catholic.
Okay.
It's
been known to happen.
And for 5 years, he was out of the Gnostic church scene in Paris. But in 1900, he asked to come back to his church.
Okay, that's been known to happen too.
And during those intervening 5 years, a bishop that Doinel had consecrated, Tausinasius, had been in charge. And he allowed Doinel to come back, and he reconsecrated him as a bishop.
Okay.
And his name then was Tao Jules.
Okay.
Previously, Doinel had been Valentinus II.
Okay.
So he was not quite the same stature as he had been, but he was brought back into the fold and died a few years later. Yeah.
All right.
The ordaining of women, which of course even now is controversial in many religious communities, that would have been huge at the time, right? Even the more liberal denominations, very few of them were ordaining women.
You're probably right. To be honest, I don't know. I rarely studied the Protestants, so I don't have a lot of knowledge at my fingertips about them. But because Doinel was a follower of Valentinus, who advocated radical egalitarianism, Valentinus was an early Gnostic and had been in the 2nd century or so, and had been actually a candidate for Pope at that time. So the Valentinian philosophy does advocate complete equality between men and women. And so that is where Doinel got this idea to ordain men and women.
Okay. Yeah, there were some Protestant churches that were ordaining women at that time. It wasn't terribly common. Certainly the Episcopalians weren't, the Lutherans weren't, the Catholics obviously were not, but there were Congregationalists and Unitarian Universalists, and even, strangely enough, around that time, there were even some fundamentalist churches that were ordaining women, as well as some of the holiness churches. Some very, very conservative churches did ordain women, and we're not going to get into the reasons why that was going on, but that is what happened at that time. But certainly it was not something that was that common within liturgical churches by any means. To what degree did these clergy have public ministries, or were they primarily secret and operating, relatively privately and offering the sacraments to people who had esoteric interests or involvements, or did they actually any of them have buildings or public ministries?
I don't know if they had buildings. I know that there was a membership requirement in Doinel's church, the Gnostic Church of France, that you had to be somewhat, they didn't accept everyone.
Okay.
I don't know the exact way they examined candidates for the church, but they were selective.
Okay.
Because it was an esoteric society, and they were careful about who they let in. They had to have a certain amount of education and ability and leaning towards the spiritual life before they would be allowed to be full members.
Okay.
So as far as speaking out in public, and I don't get the sense that they were secret, but I also don't get the sense that they reached out a lot to the public and, got up on a soapbox in the park and preached.
Okay. I was just wondering if they had any kind of public presence or whether it was entirely secret. But it sounds to me like they were there, they were operating, but you had to find them, perhaps.
Probably, yeah.
We do have to wind down the show, but where can people find you online, Dr. Houston?
They can email me at alexandria@post.harvard.edu. I don't have a website any longer, but my books are all on Amazon, and there is an author page if they want to find out about the other books I've written and about the Priests, Gnostics, and Magicians volume.
Excellent, excellent. And as I said before, I do encourage our viewers and listeners to absolutely check out that book. It's great. And again, thank you so much for writing it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for taking the time to be on the show. Folks who are watching or listening, we have a question for you. Does the Gnostic Restoration affect your life as a Gnostic today? What do you think about what you've been hearing here? We'd love to hear from you. You can certainly post your comments on the YouTube video page. You can also visit our Facebook page and chip in and give some of your opinions there. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, we do appreciate those of you who are our Patreon supporters. If you are interested in supporting the Gnostic Wisdom Network and shows like Talk Gnosis, you can go to patreon.com/Gnostic and pledge a small amount per video or podcast. We really do appreciate your support. And so once again, I want to thank Dr. Houston and my special guest, Brother Jonathan. Thank you for joining us tonight, brother. It's very much appreciated. And good. And as always, we do appreciate your feedback. And if you wish to send us a note, you can write to us at talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
This has been a production of the Gnostic Wisdom Network. For more information about this and all of GWN's programming, please visit gnosticwisdom.net. The opinions expressed in this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions of GWN, the Apostolic Johannite Church, or any other organization. This has been released under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 International License and is brought to you by the generous support of our patrons. To support our programs and become a patron, please visit patreon.com/Gnostic. That's patreon.com/GNOSTIC.